Thank you very much, Wedge, and thank you, Foundation, for the opportunity to be here and to speak with you tonight. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on and pay my respects to elders past and present. Forgive me if at times I may ramble a little, because I literally did get off the plane yesterday morning and it was a week-long trip, 48 hours there, 48 hours back, and about 3 days on the ground in Burkina Faso. But distressing at times, but it's a very desperate situation there with something like 2 million people at risk of severe hunger. But I can speak more about that later on if you wish. There's the old saying that the poor will always be with us, but I tend to have a much more optimistic view. I think a just world without poverty is possible, and I think that huge advances have been made and that much more can be achieved. But those of us who strive to see poverty as a thing of the past must come to grips with a changing world, a world in which some of the old certainties are no longer viable, a world that opens up new possibilities for sustained action for change and the pursuit of social justice. Tonight, I'd first like to look at the changing nature of poverty and development, then the changing nature of civic action, and then try to bring these two discussions together. But first, let's celebrate some successes. Over the period 1981 to 2005, the percentage of the world's population living below $1.25 a day was halved, falling from about 1/2 of the global population to a quarter. The actual numbers of people living in poverty fell by 500 million, from 1.9 billion to 1.4 billion people. Real people's lives have improved in tangible ways. A few examples. Over the last 20 years, according to the United Nations, aid has helped save about 14,000 lives a day. Aid has helped to eradicate polio in the Pacific. Back in 1990, the mortality rate for children under 5 was around 12 million. By 2010, this number declined to around 7.6 million. Still far too high, but definitely an historic improvement. The number of children in Africa who are dying from malaria was cut from a peak of around 1 million in 2004 to around 700,000 in 2010. And worldwide, the deaths of pregnant women was cut by almost half between 1990 and 2010, from an estimated 543,000 to 287,000. Keeping these successes in mind, let's turn to some of the changes in poverty and development. First, there's the geography of poverty, and that's changing quite dramatically. People living in poverty can be most readily found in what the United Nations classified as least developed countries, places like Burkina Faso, where I was last week, or the Solomon Islands, or Timor-Leste. But sheer numbers on the global stage tell a very different story. The vast majority of the world's poor, some 74% of the bottom 1.2 billion people living on less than $1.25 a day, now live in middle-income countries. Countries like India, China, Indonesia and Nigeria. There are more than 400 million people living in poverty in India, more than 60 million in Indonesia. About half the world's poor live in India and China. Secondly, as the geography of poverty has changed, so has inequality grown. It's become the underbelly of global prosperity. Income inequality has risen in many more countries than it has fallen. In the Asia-Pacific region, most countries have higher income inequality now than they did a few decades ago. Inequality is particularly acute in middle-income countries, where most of the world's poor live. For example, inequality in earnings has doubled in India over the past 2 decades, making it the worst performer on this count of all emerging economies. The top 10% of wage earners now make 12 times more than the bottom 10%, up from a ratio of 1 to 6 in the 1990s. India's per capita income has tripled from about 19,000 rupees in 2002-2003 to 53,000 rupees in 2010-11, with an average growth of almost 14% over the same period, despite the fact that the absolute number of people living in poverty has remained about the same. This is because much of the impressive economic growth in India has been in urban areas and the services sector, which has done little for reducing poverty in rural areas dependent upon agricultural production. The link between inequality and well-being in developed countries like Australia has been graphically demonstrated by the work of social researchers Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, especially in their book, The Spirit Level. As the subtitle of the book asserts, more equal societies almost always do better. Pickett and Wilkinson examined some 23 countries' records and a range of well-being indicators. Indicators like teenage pregnancies, to literacy scores, to levels of obesity. They also checked the record with all 50 American states. They then matched these records against the levels of income inequality. The general picture that emerged was that a more equal society tended to have higher levels of well-being, including for those with higher incomes. This finding held across the 23 countries, as well as across the 50 US states. Inequality exists not only in relation to income, but also in relation to gender, race, culture, power, status, employment and access to social services. Inequality keeps poor people poor and reduces the scope for economic growth to eliminate poverty. Unequal societies are more vulnerable to economic and other shocks, as well as the impacts of increasing scarcity, volatility and climate change. In regions where the greatest poverty reduction advances have occurred, there remain significant populations whose condition has not improved. For this reason, some of the observers suggest that the main reason the world is unlikely to achieve the United Nations Millennium Development Goals is because growing inequalities in a majority of developing countries are slowing down national progress. I'd argue that a key development challenge for the next decade is to confront increasing inequality, not necessarily absolute poverty directly, and some of the biggest causes of poverty are therefore not the lack of development in the country as a whole, but are instead the political, economic and social marginalisation of particular groups. This most clearly is the case when one considers gender inequality, which regrettably is a constant rather than a change. Gender continues to be a key determinant of poverty. The face of poverty is still that of a woman or of a girl. The statistics may be familiar, but they're still worth restating. Women and girls make up 70% of those people living in poverty. Women are 2/3 of the world's 1 billion illiterate adults. Women do 60% of the world's work, produce half the world's food, but earn only 10% of the world's income and own just 1% of the world's property. Women hold only 19% of parliamentary seats worldwide and only 16% of ministerial posts. And in our region, despite the recent electoral successes of free women in the general elections in Papua New Guinea, which trebled the number of women in that 109-seat parliament, women make up only 5% of parliamentarians across the whole Pacific. Violence and sexual abuse affects 1 in 3 women around the world. 1 in every 3 women around the world has been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused in her lifetime. So that's the constant. But then there's also the increasing scarcity of resources. Competition for land, water, energy and carbon space is becoming acute and putting unsustainable pressure on the world's most critical resources. This competition for scarce resources threatens the food availability and secure livelihoods of hundreds of millions of women and men living in poverty. Every night for decades, more than 800 million people have gone to bed hungry. In 2008, the global food price crisis pushed that number over 1 billion for the first time in history. The physical and mental toll of hunger, particularly during pregnancy and a child's early years, has lifelong physical and mental consequences that blight lives and efforts to eradicate poverty. But the food price crisis is also an indication of even greater challenges to come. Food and commodity prices are on the march again. On current trends, the next 20 years will see global demand for food increase by 50%, for water by 30%, and energy by 50%. The growing demand and competition for scarce resources is generated by developed and developing country policies that value growth today more than sustainable growth in the future. It has also been driven by a potent combination of population growth, urbanisation, rising income and changing diets, as well as competition from other uses. For example, food production is being squeezed by non-food uses of arable land for carbon sequestration and biofuels production. It threatens to overwhelm the clear limits of the planet's resources, especially in relation to agricultural land, fresh water and the atmosphere's absorptive capacity. I'd say, in fact, some ecological limits are close to or have already been crossed. Scarcity of resources is rarely the result of their shortage. In many cases, it's the product of entrenched inequalities, the denial of rights, and a lack of power. 3/4 of the world's hungry. Many of them women live in rural areas, and most of them work as small-scale food producers, either as farmers or labourers. They're surrounded by the means to produce food. Their hunger is not the result of a lack of food or the resources to produce it. It is because their rights are systematically neglected and they are taught in power structures and political systems where resources and the benefits from them are controlled by more powerful interests. Scarcity at the community level and the dynamics that cause it is also reflected at the global level, where powerful international interest groups and elites are competing to control the use of land, water and greenhouse gases, leading us all towards an agricultural future of land scarcity, water stress and devastating climate change. Hunger has persisted for generations, but we've now got to tackle it in very new contexts. How can we produce enough food for 9 billion people in a way that ensures food for all? How can we respect the boundaries of the Earth's land, water and carbon resources when we're already pushing many resources to their limits? Another emerging trend is increasing volatility. Over the last decade, the world's poor have experienced multiple, often simultaneous shocks to the system. Global food crisis sparked food riots in more than 20 developing countries, spikes in oil prices, global economic crisis, and an increasingly volatile climate. The number of reported weather-related disasters in some of the world's poorest countries, like Burkina Faso, where I was last week, has on average more than trebled over the past 3 decades, threatening to overwhelm the world's ability to respond. In this new era of volatility, powerful forces have emerged to secure assets and resources for themselves. Poor people are experiencing an increasing number of shocks, conflicts and crises, sweeping away their assets and overwhelming their traditional coping mechanisms. These challenges are likely to outstrip the capacity of humanity's safety net, humanitarian system and principles, and the resources designed to assist and protect those affected by disasters and conflict. Floods, droughts and cyclones have become more frequent, and the number of people affected by them has grown. Coupled with unplanned and accelerated urbanisation, environmental degradation and increased competition for resources, this has put poor people at greater risk and has repeatedly reduced their ability to get back on their feet. Because volatility reduces confidence in the future and discounts the value of long-term investing, it makes economic policy less likely to address poverty and social injustice. The final emerging trend I wish to highlight is the impact of climate change on people living in poverty. Climate change is hitting those least responsible and with the fewest resources the hardest. It's affecting their capacity to forge a sustainable livelihood. It's affecting their susceptibility to diseases. It's exposing them to greater risks of extreme weather events, droughts, floods, cyclones and the like. It's the interaction of persistent poverty, growing and multifaceted inequality with new challenges such as climate change, which makes for a difficult and challenging policy terrain. And this at a time when the crisis in global governance has deepened. Global processes are clearly under great stress, and in far too many cases have crossed the line into crisis. The lack of progress on reforming global trade rules through the World Trade Organisation's Doha round, somewhat cruelly dubbed the development round, is but one example. Progress on tackling climate change, probably the best example of a global problem requiring global action, has been lamentably inadequate. And while there have been some important achievements in the traditionally defined areas of global security, the lack of effective action on the civil war in Syria, or for that matter on the invasion of Iraq early this century, demonstrates the weaknesses of existing security mechanisms. And I won't even dwell on the half-hearted global approaches towards the various incarnations of the global financial crisis. Regional processes and national action have not effectively plugged this gap caused by inadequate global action. Yes, the African Union is more effective than its predecessor. Yes, there are important regional forums such as ASEAN. But as we move towards a multipolar world, exemplified by the rise of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa and Mexico, and the declines in the European Union of the United States, we're clearly moving into uncharted waters. Signs of turning inwards are many. The focus of the innumerable European Union summits is on their homegrown crisis. The G20 too has increasingly been transfixed by the European financial crisis. And I'm not even going to elaborate on what is obviously a narrow, visionless Australian political discourse and debate. And meanwhile, overseas aid spending is reduced for the first time in a decade. While some countries maintained or even increased spending, even traditional aid champions such as the Netherlands have cut spending. OECD figures from earlier this year show global aid spending has been cut for the first time in 14 years, down in real terms by 2.7%, or the equivalent about $3.4 billion US dollars, down to $133.5 billion. To summarise, we've had some real successes with fewer people living in poverty, but this is matched by increasing inequality. There are also a number of new developments affecting us, all of us, and people living in poverty in particular, notably the global financial crisis, climate change, and the scarcity of resources, and therefore the risks of greater conflict and insecurity. These are complex issues, and our current institutional means of dealing with them are failing. In the last 6 months, we've seen the failure of the G20 in Mexico, the Rio +20 summit, and the arms treaty negotiations in New York in addressing these concerns. So what of the changing nature of civic action? 4 experiences which illustrate for me some important trends in this area. First, in March this year, I was visiting India's capital, Delhi. I was there for the regular meeting of the Oxfam International Board, and much of my time was spent in a conference room in a hotel located on the broad boulevards of that city. But I did manage to spend a day in the other side of the city, the slums. I spent that day with an Oxfam partner organisation, a local community organisation called JOSH. JOSH works to ensure that the children of the slums enjoy their constitutional right to a basic education. JOSH doesn't provide schools, teachers or textbooks. Instead, it seeks to mobilise parents in the slums to demand that their elected representatives are held accountable for providing good quality schools for their children. I spent an hour or so on a Saturday afternoon in a community meeting organised by JOSH. Some 200 people, overwhelmingly mothers, had come together to develop what we would call a log of claims to present to candidates for the upcoming council elections. Mother after mother took to the floor to demand change. They wanted teachers to turn up at their children's schools. They wanted an end to physical and psychological abuse by teachers. They wanted textbooks and papers and pens. They wanted desks and chairs. They wanted toilets. And they wanted clean water and effective water supply at the schools. Mostly, their passion was about their daughters and their daughters' future. Their voices really were imbued with passion, anger and hope. They wanted their children to have their constitutional rights realised. They wanted a better life for their children. Talking with JOSH staff and some of the mothers later, it was clear that their campaigns to hold their elected representatives accountable had already borne fruit. The quality of schooling had improved, teachers were teaching, textbooks were being provided, toilets had been built. To another experience, this time one which has played out around the globe. This is the Occupy movement. As of February this year, this movement had made its presence felt in some 1,590 town squares around the globe. Its call for policies to benefit the 99% against the dominance of 1%, of the 1%, has galvanised public debate. Occupy lacked a political program. It didn't have its set of detailed, costed policy prescriptions. But their power, in many ways, was greater for it. They focused on values of a belief in equity, in justice, and in fairness. Occupy was important for another reason. As observers have pointed out, they had no formal leadership, no top-down organisation, and they lacked the communications infrastructure. But word of their actions spread quickly and far and wide. Occupy and similar movements, best exemplified by the Arab Spring phenomenon, illustrate new ways of achieving social change. They illustrate the observation that civil society can be very messy, that change can be unpredictable. The third experience dates back to 2007. In June of that year, Britain experienced the worst flooding for 60 years. Among the flood victims was a mother of 2 named Jenna Meredith, whose home in Hull in the country's northeast was destroyed by the floods. She and her 2 daughters had lost all their worldly possessions, and unfortunately due to financial pressures, she had stopped paying house insurance 6 months earlier. Jenna became spokesperson for local residents on her housing estate, who felt that the government was doing too little to help them. While being interviewed for the local radio station, she said that the people of Hull were living like refugees in the third world. It was a challenge Oxfam couldn't shrug, so we contacted her. We invited her to discover what life was like for poor villagers who'd recently confronted flooding in India. After returning from a 1-week trip to India, this is what Jenna said, and I'll quote her. It was heartbreaking. I've been flooded out and lost everything, so I know what it's like for the people in India. But in comparison, I feel lucky. We can go and buy food from the shops, but the people I've met have lost their crops. They haven't got anything. One of the people she met with in India was Annapurna Beharia, whose home and small family shops selling biscuits and tobacco were washed away. Annapurna was incredible. Her life had been turned upside down, and now she's been reduced to living in a corrugated shack. I cried when the floods hit Hull, but she has nothing left, and the family barely has enough food. And Jenna was overwhelmed by her face-to-face meeting with the villagers in Orissa in India. Until you go to see a country like that for yourself, it's impossible to comprehend what's really happening. I know I can't walk away from this. I'm determined to continue the campaign, not only to get aid to those in need, but also to try to do whatever we can to reduce the effects of global warming. I've had a life-changing experience. I'll do everything I can to make a difference. Jenna Meredith from Hull in England. The fourth experience of changing civil action is homegrown. Over the last few years, Oxfam has been centrally involved in 2 major campaigns to promote active citizenship, which I think are particularly noteworthy. The Make Poverty History campaign, of which I have the honour to be co-chair, has brought together more than 70 organisations and mobilised tens of thousands of Australians calling for changes in government policies. It won both sides of politics to support an increase in overseas aid, a rare bipartisan consensus which has regrettably only just broken down. Make Poverty History is a broad coalition, but it is particularly notable for the way in which it has creatively mobilised young people and people from faith-based communities and organisations. Make Poverty History's achievements are matched by the Close the Gap campaign, focusing on Indigenous people's health inequality. Launched in 2006, it again has won bipartisan support for the goal of closing the life expectancy gap within a generation. As a result of this bipartisanship, more money has flowed and public policy is increasingly directed towards improving health outcomes. Close the Gap has become part of the vernacular. Again, thousands have been mobilised. More than 178,000 people have signed the Close the Gap pledge. Well, this year, we estimate that more than 125,000 people held events in schools, colleges, workplaces, clinics and elsewhere on the 6th National Close the Gap Day. The Close the Gap campaign is led by Indigenous people and their organisations and brings together health, human rights and development organisations. The role of predominantly non-Indigenous organisations such as Oxfam is to create and sustain the political will for change and to provide resources for the overall campaign. These 4 examples of civic action illustrate for me some important developments. First, there's the focus on holding duty bearers accountable, as shown by the work of Josh, of trying to realise their constitutional right to basic education. Secondly, there's the messy and unpredictable nature of civil society, the ways in which actions can spread across borders in unplanned ways, and the power of a focus on values, all as shown by Occupy. Third, there's the importance of developing empathy, as shown by Jenna Meredith's journey from the UK to India. And finally, there's the importance of coalitions, of collective action, as demonstrated by the Make Poverty History and Close the Gap campaigns. Bringing these trends together, the changes in poverty and development and the changes in civic action, how do we move forward? Well, first, I think we need to rethink economics. If we're really going to come to grips with scarcity, the persistence of gross poverty, growing inequalities and the challenges of climate change, then we need to rethink our approach. An Oxfam researcher, Kate Rolgoff, has developed a concept of economics which puts sustainability expert Johan Rockström's concepts of planetary boundaries like freshwater use, climate regulation and the nitrogen cycle that are critical for keeping this planet in a stable state, together with the concept of social boundaries such as human rights, equity, access to education and the like. Together it creates a vision of a world where everyone has the resources to meet their human rights, while staying within the environmental limits of what this one planet can provide. It leads to different measures of progress and of well-being, moving beyond the increasingly discredited reliance on GNP. The work of Pickett and Wilkinson, the authors of the Spirit Level that I mentioned earlier, helps in this regard. Secondly, we need a different sort of politics. And I think a practising politician here helps us. Before he became leader of Britain's parliamentary opposition, Ed Miliband was the Secretary of State for Climate Change. In late 2009, just before the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, he made what I think is an extremely important speech, arguing that to address the challenge of climate change, quote, we need not just to change a set of policies, but to adapt our politics, end quote. He argued that rather than a politics of now, we need a politics of the common good. Miliband notes that what makes climate change particularly challenging, and I'd argue that this is the case for the creation of a just world without poverty as well, is that there is a significant time lag between actions and effects, and it's hard to link specific actions to long-term outcomes. The generation who needs to act and bear the cost will not be the generation that benefits. The people that will suffer the most are not causing the problem. The first aspect of Miliband's vision for how to get past the politics of now and the distant issue he notes is the importance of developing, quote, a politics that treats people not simply as consumers, but as citizens. This, he argues, means that there needs to be a willingness amongst political leaders to take the argument to people about the tough choices involved in tackling climate change, while at the same time ensuring that the burdens do not fall disproportionately on the poorest. The second piece of Miliband's jigsaw is the focus on intergenerational justice. It is simply not good enough to focus only on people alive today. He suggests that this is probably the defining characteristic of climate change and demands an important role for economics in exploring much better how to value the position of future generations. The third part of his vision recognises that there are areas where an appeal to individual self-interest can support the social need to tackle climate change. For example, communicating how a local carbon economy would create many new jobs in the renewable energy sector. He noted that if Martin Luther King had said, "I have a nightmare," nobody would have followed him. This calls for politicians and to achieve a delicate mix of candour about the challenge and a positive vision for the future. The fourth element of Miliband's politics of the common good concerns the need for greater emphasis on idealism and social justice. He said, we need a politics of climate change that speaks to people's idealism as well as to their wallets. It must chime with the ideal of a good society. In fact, he argues that it will be important to demonstrate that addressing climate change can also reduce inequality and help build stronger, inclusive societies. As Miliband concludes, this is of course the type of politics that's not just important for addressing climate change, but also for addressing issues of global poverty and inequality, the demographic challenges associated with greying populations, and the future of social security systems in a number of developed countries. So, a new form of economics and a new form of politics is needed. Simple. So what kind of renewed civil action is needed if we were to adequately respond to the global challenges we face? First, it must be based on an extended sense of empathetic horizons. Jenna Merida from Hull clearly had her horizons expanded by a direct contact with Annapurna Berheri in India, but it's simply not practicable for such direct contact to be in place on a larger scale. But social media does give us some possibilities. An example, a few years ago, Oxfam established mock refugee camps, dubbed Refugee Realities, in Melbourne and Canberra. Participants were taken on a journey not unfamiliar to refugees around the globe. In the Melbourne instance, we we took the experience one step further and directly connected students with their counterparts living in camps in Darfur and Sudan using social media. It had a profound impact. But moving on beyond directly connecting people across borders and developing that human empathy, we also need to develop a broader understanding of empathy to include the biosphere. This speaks to the importance of focusing on shared values, values that are global in their nature and infused with a sense of genuine humanity, values that are evident in the spirit of Occupy with all its weaknesses, but also in the Make Poverty History and Close the Gap campaigns. This need for a new politics, a new economics, and for renewed civil action has implications for organisations like Oxfam. It means having a willingness to clearly exploring the links between inequality and the persistence of mass poverty. It demands a holistic approach towards development, with a willingness to understand the political dimensions of development. It means less of a focus on aid per se as being the answer, sending money over there. It means changes in the ways we work, especially in middle-income countries, so that the focus is firmly on helping communities and local organisations to hold their governments accountable for the delivery of basic services, which are their right. It means learning from experiences such as those of Josh in Delhi, or that of community-based monitoring of health services in Uganda, which has contributed to significant improvements in the health of infants in that country. If we're going to change economics, change politics, and build civil action, this will also demand changes in our education system and in how activists like Oxfam work with universities. There's huge potential for this kind of collaboration, as we see the rigour of universities combined with the relevance of NGOs. It brings theory and practice closer together, and it helps develop more robust evidence on the effectiveness of civil society and active citizenship as a significant force of positive change. This type of collaboration also helps us to pilot innovative approaches to assessing impact and value for money, to be accountable to those we all seek to benefit, and in so doing to build a new generation of development activists that are equipped to deal with the kinds of challenges that the world will face in the next 50 years, and with the ability to reimagine economics, create new political agendas, and to mobilise others. Often it is the case that the first step in that journey is recognising that Australia has as much to learn from engaging on these issues as it has to give. Example, and I'll finish up on this one. Some 21 years ago, I made my first Oxfam field visit. It was 5 weeks in India and Bangladesh, and I was meeting partner organisations and communities that we work with there. I vividly remember meeting with members of scheduled tribes, it's a term for Indigenous peoples, in Orissa, in India. Late one night, I was chewing the fat with some community activists. I peppered them with questions about their situation, their struggles, and the ways they went about working for their rights to be realised. Went on for quite a while, I had a lot of questions. And then the tables were turned. I was pointedly asked about the position of Aboriginal people in Australia, about the denial of their rights. What was I and my agency doing to ensure that their rights were respected? On reflection, graphically demonstrated that the global community that we all live in was a concrete example of global solidarity. It illustrated that we all need to be accountable for our actions or our inaction, and it's not just duty bearers like governments. If we're to win a just world without poverty, then that individual responsibility, that individual accountability is a critical first step. Thank you very much.